Hi there, this is Patricia from patriciafenty.com. The tutorial I have for you today on how to design your own crochet blanket patterns was originally meant to be an online course on Udemy. I have a crocheted boho poncho course on this platform, but as some of you may know, my husband has not been well, and I've not had the time or energy to create new content this week. So I decided to make it into a free tutorial rather than having it as a paid course. I've also done something new in that I have added a donate button in the description box below and also on my about page if you feel this tutorial and my other tutorials are of value and you want to contribute in some way. And for that, I would be very grateful. Now here is the tutorial. Hi there, this is Patricia from patriciafenty.com, and today I'm going to do a basic tutorial on how you can design your own crocheted blanket. Now these are blankets that are done in rows going back and forth, not in a round like a granny square. It's just rows that go back and forth. And it's surprisingly easy to design your own blanket, but it does involve quite a bit of math. So I hope I can simplify that for you here, and I'll give you some examples of how you can pick a stitch pattern and design your own blanket. So let's get started. Now the first thing you want to do is you want to choose a stitch design that you want to work with. And then you want to create a test swatch. You want to create a sample. And in order to find a stitch pattern, this is a good resource, the Crochet Stitch Dictionary. It gives you a lot of different stitch patterns. And then on YouTube, there's all kinds of tutorials for different stitch designs that you can use. And so you want to pick a stitch that you like, and I recommend a simple one to begin with. And so then you want to create the sample swatch, and in order to do that, you need to calculate your multiples of each stitch. So I'll show you how to do that. Now you want to create a swatch that is approximately 4 inches by 4 inches. That's sort of the industry standard. You can create it whatever size you like, but you want it to be at least 4 inches by 4 inches, which is 10 centimeters by 10 centimeters. So this is a double V stitch, and what you will see in the pattern right up, it will be a multiple of so many stitches plus perhaps some extra stitches, plus stitches for the turning chain. So in this example here, this is a double V stitch. The multiple is 2 plus 2 for the foundation chain. And so what that means is you have a multiple of 2 stitches for the actual stitch pattern, and then there's 2 stitches for the turning chain. So if you're doing a swatch like this, you want to measure a chain that's about 4 inches, and for this yarn it's about 20 stitches for this. It's this number 3 medium weight yarn. So say 20 stitches, and you want to divide the multiple into that. So the multiple is 2. So that would go, I'm going to do the multiple times 9, which would give me 18 stitches, plus 2 for the turning chain is 20 stitches. So the foundation chain would be 20 stitches. So you'd go ahead and make a swatch using that stitch pattern. And I have the written directions here, so you can just stop the video and read that here. I also will have a blog post, and you can find the link for that in the description box below, where you can go and find all these written instructions there. If you're working with this pattern here, this is the Tulip Stitch design. The multiple for this is 4 stitches plus 5 for the turning chain. So if you wanted to create a swatch for this, you would take roughly 20 stitches and take your multiple of 4. You want them to work into 4. So you could either do 4 times 16, or you can do 4 times 5, which is 20. So I would choose 4 times 5. So you would have 20 chains plus 5 for your turning chain. So that would be 25 chains for the foundation chain. And again, I have this written example here. So here I have a basket weave stitch, and this one is a little bit different. And what we have is we have a multiple of 6 plus 5 plus 2. So the 6 stitches is this set of 3 stitches here and this set of 3 stitches here. But in order for this pattern to work out, there needs to be an extra set of 3 stitches. And that will help to create an odd number of these patterns in order for this stitch design to work out. So you have your multiple of 6 plus 5. So this 5 includes the 3 stitches to create this extra multiple of 3, plus this design happens to have a stitch at the end and the beginning of each row. So that's the extra 2. But then there's also an extra 2 chains for the turning chain. So that's 6 plus 5 plus 2. So say you want to do 20. What is the closest to 20? That would be divisible by 6. That would be 18. So you do 3 repeats of your pattern of 6 stitches, which gives you 18 stitches, plus 5 gives you 23 stitches, plus 2 for your turning chain, for a total of 25 chains for this design. So again, here is the written directions for that, and you can pause this or go over to the blog to read it there. So that is how you can figure out multiples and then use that to create a swatch. Now your swatches give you a lot of information. They tell you how many stitches you're using per inch, tells you how many rows you need, because of course you can make your blanket using any type of yarn that you like, using any size hook that you like. And so the swatch gives you all the information that you need, and it's really important to do a swatch, and I'll just insert a little segment here that explains what happens if you don't. So here's a good example of why you would want to create a swatch before beginning a project, and why you would want to do a swatch that repeats your pattern for several rows. When I started to design this blanket, I used something called a silk stitch. And this stitch is a row of double crochet and then a row of a cluster stitch, which is 1 single crochet, 2 double crochets, skip 2 stitches, a single and 2 doubles. So the cluster is a bit of an uneven stitch. It kind of tilts to one side. And what I didn't realize until I got well into this project, because the sample I did was a long sample, I just went this way and did a couple of rows. Like I just did it, the pattern repeat twice. So once I got into this pattern, I realized that it was all going off onto an angle like this. And at first I thought it was my tension, but I know that I do really good tensions. So I ripped it out and I tried it again and it went cockeyed again. So then I did this swatch. And the problem was that you have a row of double crochet that's an even tension. It's going straight up and down. Then you have a row of a cluster that's twisted. It's actually going in the other direction. And the interesting thing is the fabric is pulling in the other direction. So it's the fact that the cluster isn't a straight, even stitch. So you want to be careful when you're picking out a stitch pattern. You definitely want to do a swatch, because what this means is this needs an odd number of rows so that this cluster it would go back every third row than every second row because it's always pulling in the same direction. You want to balance the tension, but now the clusters are all going in one direction and they're pulling the fabric in that one direction. And you know, the stitch books don't tell you that. They don't tell you the tension of the fabric can go off to the side like that. And honestly, I don't know why they would create a pattern like this. I guess maybe they would use it in like a design that has a whole variety of stitches. And the thing is you can't even reverse this because the whole design is such that the pattern is on the front, not on the back. The back just looks like double crochets. So that was a really important lesson learned. So how do you remedy this? Either you don't use the stitch, you look for something different, or what I did was I just eliminated the row of double crochets and I just used the cluster row, and I just went back and forth with the cluster row, and that's what I did for this blanket tutorial here. And it created a really beautiful stitch and a beautiful texture, and it created a nice even edge, and it just went back, the tension goes back and forth in each row, and it created a nice balanced tension, and that remedied the problem. So that's just something to consider. Now the next step is you want to decide on what size blanket you want to make. So I'll insert a chart here, and these are just some of the basic blanket sizes that are available. Of course, you can make the blanket any size you like. These are just some guidelines. And again, I have this in the blog, the written blog, if you want to check it out there. Then once you've decided what size blanket you want to make, then you want to calculate how long to make your foundation chain. So using your sample swatch, we use an example of a blanket size, say 30 inches by 36 inches. And I'm sorry, I'm just going to do imperial here. I won't be doing metric. So use your sample swatch. So divide 30 inches, which is the width of your blanket, by an even denominator that fits onto your swatch. So say 3 inches. So 30 divided by 3 inches equals 10 repeats. So then you want to count how many stitches are in 3-inch piece of your swatch. So just take your tape measure and you go ahead and count how many stitches are in that 3-inch piece. You then multiply that by 10 repeats and you work that multiple into the stitch pattern. So I'll show you each one of these designs how to do that. So you can pause this here and just review these written directions, and then we'll carry on. All right, so let's start with the double V stitch. So when you measure, you want to measure sort of in the middle of the swatch. You'll count your stitches in the 3-inch section. So I have 13 stitches in 3 inches. So you take the 13 stitches and multiply that by your 10 repeats, and that would equal 130 stitches. The multiple for this pattern is 2 stitches plus 2 for the turning chain. So 2 multiplies evenly into 130. So all you need to do is have 130 chains plus 2 chains for your turning chain. So a total of 132 chains will give you a 30-inch blanket using this yarn with this stitch. And again, you can pause the video here to review that. Now to calculate the number of rows that you need, all you do here is you measure the height of each row. And for this stitch, the row is 1/2 inch. If you want the blanket to be 36 inches, then you divide 36, or sorry, you take 36 and you divide it by 0.5, and that gives you 72. So you would need 72 72 one row repeats. And so you can pause the video here and take a look at this. Now for the tulip stitch, in this case, if you count the stitches, this is a little bit trickier to count. You'll have to count your foundation chain stitches here. And so you measure your 3-inch segment, and I've already counted this. And in 3 inches, there's 14 stitches. So then again, using the same size, the 30-inch, you would multiply 14 stitches by 10 repeats, which will give you 140 stitches. The multiple for this pattern is 4 plus 5 chains for the turning chain. So 4 multiplies into 140 evenly. So in this case, you would have your 140 chains plus 5 for your turning chain. So your foundation chain will be 145 chains. And then again, to measure how many rows you would need for this design, you would measure the height of the row. And these clusters are a little bit tricky to measure. And so, but it's approximately 3/4 of an inch. So here is where you would take your 36 inches of height, divide it by 0.75, and you would get a number of 48. And that would tell you that you would need 48 rows for this blanket to be 36 inches in height. And again, here are the written directions for that. Now, one thing to mention, if you're choosing a pattern that has a scalloped edge, your last row will have this shape here. So you're going to have to level that out somehow on your very last row. So you would just want to do a row that is a combination of double crochet, half double crochet, single crochets all the way along in order to even that out. And I'll just demonstrate here what I would do with this pattern. So I will chain 3 just to get my height up even with that first cluster, turn my work, and I'll just take a look at it and lay it down. And I think I need 1 more chain to get over to that top of that cluster. So I'll chain 4. So that'll be like a chain 3 and then a chain 1 to get over to the top of that first cluster. So that's where you sort of have to work with it and just sort of figure it out. So I'm just going to go into that stitch at the top there and do a single crochet. And you just have to play around with this and try to even it out as best as you can. And then I'll do another single crochet into the top of the next stitch. And there's really no rule. You just sort of want to figure that out. So that's brought me across the top of the cluster. I'm not going to go into this chain stitch here. So I'm going to go down into the dip, and I'll do that as a double crochet. You might need a treble crochet here, but I think a double crochet will work. And then in the next stitch, I'll do a half double crochet. So that's bringing me up the side. And then into the top of the next one, I'll do a single crochet and then another single crochet. And that pattern will probably work out just right all the way along. And you can see how that is evening out the top of that last row. So you do have to sort of just figure that out for yourself. And then once you've evened out the top of the row, then you would do your row of single crochet all the way around if you want to do a border. Now, to calculate the foundation chain for the basket weave stitch, this one is a little bit trickier because you have those interesting multiples. So for this one, again, you want to measure your 3 inches, and because that divides nicely into your width of 30. And so here I have 14 stitches. So there's 14 stitches in a 3-inch section. So again, you'd multiply 14 by 10 repeats. So you'd have 140 stitches. Now in this case, your multiple is 6 plus 5 plus 2 for the turning chain. So you take your 140 stitches and you subtract 5. Then you get 135 stitches. You divide that by 6. Then you get 22.5. So you can either round up or round down to the nearest denominator. So we'll round up to say 23. So then you would multiply 23 by 6. And that will give you 138 stitches. Plus your 5, you add that back in for the pattern repeat. So that brings you up to 143, and then you have 2 stitches for the turning chain. So for this one, your foundation chain will be 145 chains. And again, you can pause that here and take a look at the written directions, or you can go over to my blog and read it there. And then to figure out how many rows you need for this pattern, you want to measure your row repeat. And in this case, this pattern has a 4-row repeat. These were both just 1-row repeats, but this one has 4 rows to the pattern. So in order to calculate this, you want to measure the 4 rows. And you're measuring from the bottom stitch of the first row to the top stitch of the last row. And in this case, 4 rows works out to 1.5 inches. And then the blanket height is 36 inches. So 36 divided by 1.5 equals 24 4-row repeats. So actually, it's 24 times 4 is 96 rows. So there'd be a total of 96 rows for this pattern. And so what you'll notice is that these patterns are all different. They work up quite differently. And this pattern here is more compressed. The stitch is more compressed. And this one here is quite full and open, as is this one. And of course, depending on if you're doing rows of single crochet, half double crochet, or double crochet, that will all dictate how many rows you need to do. Now, of course, you could just crochet until you get the blanket to the height that you want. And this calculation isn't quite so important, but your width is. You want to get the width correct. So the other way you can do your foundation chain is you can just make it to the width that you want and then work your multiples into that. And so that's another way to do it. So what I find with that, though, sometimes is that the foundation chain, the pattern will condense or stretch out depending on the actual stitch. So doing a swatch just gives you a more accurate calculation. So that is how you calculate how many chains and rows you need to create your blanket. Now I'll just talk a little bit whether you want to do a border or not. So not all blankets require a border. It really depends on the stitch design that you've chosen. If you have a very chunky sort of stitch design and the side is quite solid, you may not require a border at all. If it's a loose lacy design, you may want to add a border. So it really depends on the stitch. So if you decide not to do a border, then I do recommend that you begin the blanket with a row of single crochet and then work your pattern into that row of single crochet and then finish the blanket with a row of single crochet. And that gives the top and the bottom of the blanket a nice finish. And if you do decide to do a border around a blanket like this, and especially a pattern where you're going back and forth, what you have is all these row ends. So before you do any kind of border, you actually want to create a foundation row of single crochet around the blanket to even everything out, because there's no stitches here. So you do a row of single crochet all the way around so that you have a nice foundation to work into with any crochet border design that you like. And so I'm a fan of really simple borders, and this is a granny square blanket. So this was worked in the round, not going back and forth, and there was a nice finished edge to work into, but just the granny square finish itself was kind of simple. So for this one, I just did a row of double crochet, and it's super simple. And in the corner, I ended up doing, 3 double crochets to get around the corner. And that just gives a nice simple finish. I'm a fan of simple borders. I really like simple borders. It's a nice way to frame the blanket without taking anything away from the blanket itself. And here's another granny square blanket where I just did a row of single crochet, and I did that into the back loop of the stitch, and it gives this nice little ridge around and just frames the blanket really nicely. And I just did it in the same color as the last row. But again, these 2 blankets are working in the round, and so you wouldn't need to do that preliminary single crochet row around the blanket. You only need to do that if you're doing blankets where you're working in the rows back and forth and you don't actually have a stitch to work to in the end of the rows. So to work into the side of your blanket, it will be a little bit tricky because, again, you just don't have any stitches to crochet into. You're crocheting into the end of your rows. So to the best of your ability, you want to find a stitch that you can go into and do a single crochet. And then just here, I'm going to have to push through the fabric, and I recommend picking up 2 strands of yarn for each stitch. I have 3 there. There's 2 now. You don't want to go through just 1 strand. You want to pick up 2. And this one here is quite obvious to go into, and you want to space these out as best as you can, making it nice and even. And sometimes you'll have a real obvious space here, and so you may do 1 single crochet in this stitch, you may do 2. It just sort of depends on how the tension is working along the side of the blanket. So you just work these single crochets into the end of each row, and then you can see here how that's creating a nice little foundation row to work into. And what you want to watch for is, because you don't have actual stitches to crochet into, if you do too many single crochets, it's going to be too full and it'll sort of fan out. And if you have too few stitches, it'll pull the side of the blanket in. So this is something where you just sort of have to gauge your spacing so that they're nice and evenly spaced and an even tension along the side of the blanket. And then I'll show you how you can work around the corner. So you can see here how I've worked along the edge here, and it's nice and even. In some places I did put 2 single crochets in the bigger spaces, but I didn't do it in all of them. And again, just trying to keep the spacing nice and even. And then there's no actual stitch count here. It's just doing the best you can to make this nice and even. And then as you come up into the corner, again, you're not going to have any real stitches or real corner to work into. So you just have to find a space that would work really well. And each corner will be a little bit different. So I've got this last stitch here and just sussing it out here. This is a little bit tricky. There's a knot here, but there's this nice little space here, and that's what I'm going to work my corner into. So in this corner, I'll do 3 single crochets to go around the corner. If you're using a finer yarn, you might have to do 5 single crochets. And then now you'll be at the top of your last row, and those are just regular stitches, and this will be really nice to work into. So you just work across the top and then work down the other side in the same way as you came up this first side. Now if you decide to create a blanket without doing a border, then I do recommend that you begin your blanket with a row of single crochet and finish it with a row of single crochet, and that just gives it a really nice finish. So if you were to do that, then your calculation for your foundation chain would be a little bit different, because all the math is the same except for your turning chain. So what'll happen in this one, instead of having your 143 stitches plus 2 for the turning chain, you'll have 143 stitches plus 1 for the turning chain, because the turning chain is just for the row of single crochet. And then you actually start working your pattern right into the row of single crochets. So in this one, it starts with a chain 3, which counts as a double crochet, and it actually starts with a row of 144 double crochets. And as you begin to work the pattern, you're working into the correct multiples. So in this one here, for instance, here we go, flip that over. For this one here, instead of having a 132 plus 2 for your turning chain, you would do a foundation chain of single crochet. You do 132 chains plus 1 for your turning chain and crochet back. And then you'd begin the tulip stitch. You'd follow the pattern, not including the turning chain. It would just be a 2-stitch repeat, and you'd have 132 stitches. I know that's a little bit tricky, but basically you're crocheting into a row that has the turning chain of just 1, rather than the turning chain that the pattern requires. And then the other thing you want to take into account is whenever you are doing a beginning chain for any blanket, you want to make the foundation chain loose. And you can see here, this one I did try to crochet it loose, but because of the design, it pulls in. And this is a very common problem with blankets or shawls or scarves, that the first row tends to pull in because that foundation chain needs to be looser than your regular stitch tension. So the way to remedy that is to either go up a half a size or 1 size in your crochet hook. If you're proficient with your crochet tension, make sure you just make that a very loose foundation chain. And so that is really all that you need to know about designing your blanket. And you can be playful, and of course the swatches are really great because you can use them to try different pattern designs, different color combinations, to see what it looks like to have each row in a different color, or to change the color every 3 or 4 rows. And the swatches are great to play around with that. The last thing I will show you is to calculate how much yardage you need for any given project. So in order to calculate how much yarn you need, again, you're going back to your swatches. Your swatches are a wealth of information. So what you want to do is you will take your swatch and measure the exact measurement of the actual swatch. So we'll use the tulip stitch for an example. So this measures 5 inches wide and 4.5 inches tall. You multiply those 2 numbers together to get the measurement in square inches. So 5 by 4.5 is 22.5 square inches. Then you take the measurement of your blanket. So you take 30 inches by 36 inches, we'll have 180 square inches. divide that by the swatch size. So 180 divided by 22.5 equals a total of 48 swatches. Now you just want to unravel your swatch and measure how much yarn you used in that swatch. So say this is 20 yards that I've used in this swatch. So then you take your number of swatches, 48 swatches by 20 yards will give you a total of 960 yards. And that will give you a really close calculation for the amount of yarn that you will need. It won't be perfect, but it'll be quite close. So in this case, each ball is 232 yards. So I would need a little over 4 balls of yarn of this particular yarn to make this blanket 30 by 36. So there you go. And again, here is the written directions for that. All right, so that is all the math that is required to figure out how to design your own crocheted blanket. But here is a secret. You can use that math to design any project that you like. You could design a scarf, you could design a pocket shawl, you could design a poncho, a tablecloth, you could design a cowl like this. It's all the same thing. You're just figuring out what the dimensions of the project are and then applying the math to that. And so you just figure out what the panel sizes are and you create a project out of that using the math that I showed you. So you can do any number of projects once you know how to figure out your multiple repeats and how to calculate those into the size of project that you want. So here's a blanket that I'm working on. This is the next project that I'm creating. This is a basket weave stitch and it's so beautiful. And this I'm doing without a border because I think the pattern itself, it's complex, it's beautiful, and I don't want to have a border to take away or to compete with the pattern. So this is one where I started with a row of single crochet and I'll finish with a row of single crochet. This here was the blanket that I was giving the demonstration on, and this one here I did do a border on it, but with this tutorial you can do it with or without the border. And this is a border that's a crab stitch, and it's very simple and it's lovely. And this here is the box stitch to create a pocket shawl. And I do have a tutorial for this. This could be made into a scarf, into a blanket, into a poncho. You just have to adjust the size of your panels. So there's any number of projects that you can design. This here is a scarf project, and same thing, it's just using the alpine stitch. And this I did create a border. It had sort of a lacy edge and it's just a single crochet edge. This also worked well without a border. So there's any number of projects you can design, and once you get proficient, you can then go into mixing up your patterns, and you can combine different stitch patterns to create a more complicated design. And the way you do that is what I have here is I have my biggest stitch design is a multiple of 8 stitches. So then all the other stitches have to divide into 8. So I have this scallop stitch here. Oops, I'm upside down, so I'll flip this around. So there's this scallop stitch, which is 8 stitches. There's a V stitch, which is a multiple of 4. I have front post single crochets and half double crochets, which are multiples of 1. I have regular double crochets, which are a multiple of 1. And I have a half double crochet chain 1, which is a multiple of 2. So long as your multiples work into your biggest stitch design, then you can combine stitch designs, and that can be a lot of fun. So there you go. I hope this has given you some inspiration and some confidence to design your own projects. So I hope you enjoy this tutorial. Please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my YouTube channel for more creative and inspiring videos.